Thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about where AI is going for creatives, because what Holly and Matt have been building in their art practice and spawning, I think, is just super inspiring. And uh, I'm excited to get into the conversation. And as usual, please, if you have any questions, put them into the chat function at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the conversation, we'll be looking for questions that advance the kind of football down the field, and call on people to ask the questions. So please put them in there. And before we get into today's conversation, I want to begin with a note from our sponsor, Digital Original. So if you are not already familiar with Digital Original, there are two things to know about them. For one, Digital Original is a new digitized art standard that claims not to lose value over time and to potentially solve the biggest risk of buying NFTs. Secondly, they are also a software solution to help galleries, dealers, artists, and collectors adopt digital originals into their practices. So it's definitely worth checking out if you're curious to learn more, and you can find a link to their site in the comment feed below. Check it out. It's a quite provocative concept, and maybe it will resonate with some of you. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming on Our World, Holly and Matt.
Thanks for having
Thank you for
us.
having us.
Lovely to be here. Also to see some familiar names in the group. This is very nice.
A little bit of a campfire over here, digital campfire. But so, one of the purposes and kind of missions of this show is to talk to people who are from the art side about how technology is evolving the ecosystem they experience, and to also talk about people from the tech side about how they're thinking about art in the context of the innovation that they're driving. And you guys are a special treat because you are both artists and also you are kind of a tech company. And not only are you a tech company as co-founders of Spawning, but from all my conversations with AI creatives, they seem to look at you as these kinds of freedom fighters, as these Bonnie and Clyde style non-violent versions of standing up against the robber barons of this age. And it's really great to talk to you. So I just want to begin um, by going back a little bit to 2016, which seems to be like a, a touchstone year in the history of the development of AI. And Holly, I believe you were at Stanford Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics when you and Matt created Spawn, which was your machine learning system that would take in vocal recordings of hundreds of people and then output unique original voice music. And from the very beginning, you were stressing ethical training data and the importance of making sure that you got express consent from the people that you included in your data sets. So why were you thinking about AI ethics all the way back in 2016? And what inspired you to build that into Spawn? What inspired Spawn, generally?
Wow, it's almost kind of hard to rewind like a full decade, but we'll give it a go. I mean, you know, we've been digital musicians, digital artists for a really long time. So 2016 was, as you mentioned, a really interesting time for some academic research papers that were released, and that kind of kicked off a lot of the kind of flurry that we still see happening today. I remember it was like sample RNN, I think, came out that year, and yeah, anyways, just a bunch of different style transfer algorithms and things that we just started playing around with. And the thing that we were really drawn to was specifically to work with audio rather than scores. So a lot of AI research at the time was kind of focused on automated score writing because that's a symbolic AI kind of approach. It's a bit more kind of old school. And a lot of the energy was going towards that. And around 2016 was when some of the audio generation was starting. And for me, as a sound artist with a background in computer music, that was a thousand times more exciting than kind of automated Beethoven or automated Bach. I was like, oh, we can actually deal with the materiality of this stuff and we can generate something out of nothing and, or not really out of nothing, trained on something else. Like a very key point there. But so that's kind of what I think originally drew us, yeah, to work with machine learning. It was a kind of we've always been people who have experimented with sound as material, and this was like an entirely new world of sound material opening up.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess on the ethics question, it's funny, we've never really framed it as ethics because at the time, I mean, there were a lot of people thinking about machine learning ethics, but with a very, very different focus. On the data side, it just seemed like the most interesting question, honestly. And in retrospect, it's kind of loaded with these ethical considerations, obviously, because we've seen what happened in post GPT world and post kind of like supermodel world. This has become really pregnant for people, but for us, really, it was so basic as when you're first invited to train a model, you have and particularly then you had very little options or choices. And the one choice you did have was what data do you want to train it on? And because you weren't training in, like, we're not in this was a long time ago, you weren't training these super general models. It felt very personal, right? Because it's like, okay, we want to train a voice model. Whose voice do you want to train it on, right? You get one shot, you get one choice. You want to train a music model or an art model for that matter. You had very, very limited parameters on what you trained on. So it felt a bit more explicit, the choice. Um, and of course, like when presented with that choice, the first thing that came to mind was like, oh, this is going to be a really big deal. Coming from the history, I mean, we've tried to actually kind of dissociate what we call spawning from the sampling situation. But everybody coming into this conversation is already knows the history of sampling and file sharing and so on and so forth. And so you're like, oh well, this is going to be people are going to create a big fuss about this. And so then of course that invites us to say, well, what would we do, right? If you wanted to be good stewards or if you wanted to set some good precedent here, what's the most interesting thing you could do? And actually the most interesting thing we thought was to train Spawn on us and people in our immediate environment. And we use the analogy of a child, right? We called Spawn an AI baby, for better or worse. I mean, it was like a casual thing that we did initially, and then of course once it got into the press, we were like, well, should we have made that analogy? Particularly now we have a baby ourselves. It's an imperfect analogy, but the idea there was saying, okay, well, if you're going to train the system, it would be nice to see it as more local, train, and actually that also gives you a better sense of benchmarking a system. For those who aren't familiar, benchmarking is this idea of testing how good a model is, right? And that, okay, if we produce the data that goes into it, we have a much greater idea what's going on, right? Like, does it convincingly sound like Holly or our collaborator? Has it generalized or abstracted away from what we initially fed it? These kind of questions become easier to discern when you have some control over the data. But that's what kind of kicked it off, as more just thinking, this is an interesting question that occurred to us as something that would become of real consequence going forward. And I think, so, and as such, we're like, okay, well, this is our kind of position on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
It
part of
seems
like, sorry, just to follow up on that, I think because we started so long ago and we did have to make those creative decisions, we also started to see how different creative decisions we would make in the training data selection process would actually impact the outcome of whatever, however we were prompting the model. So we really started seeing that as a part of the artwork. And I'm really glad that we started when we did before things became so kind of like productized and well formed in a way, because it really showed us that you had all of these points for creative intervention in the model making process, that it's not just this one point of prompting or this one kind of out point. It's like the whole full stack of model making. There are so many points for creativity and for human in the loop kind of intervention. And so we started seeing every aspect as an art making kind of aspect.
I mean, like one analogy that seems to make sense to me is cooking and food. And that if you have really good organic ingredients and you kind of are careful about the ingredients you're putting into a dish, you're able to make that dish both more nutritive and more sustainable, but also higher quality. And then if you have this kind of like synthetic, processed kind of, totally encompassing kind of list of ingredients where you don't really even know what they necessarily mean, you're putting something out that may have some kind of health benefits. Were you thinking about this kind um, of organic, like farm to table, small approaches to model creation back then as being something virtuous?
We have actually said farm to table data before.
It's I mean it's a good analogy in a sense. I think it's an imperfect analogy, right? Because if you were to put all the ingredients in the world together to create a super meal, it likely wouldn't be as kind of true in its outputs as a big general model are. I think one of the difficult things we have to contend with in kind of advocating for this approach is also just acknowledging the brilliance of the other approach, right? Um, but I think you're right, and I mean, I think we'll probably get into it with DeepSeek and other things that have happened since then. Our point or our position, particularly as art makers, is just going back to what Holly said, right? Like this kind of bespoke farm to table approach where you can account for everything that went in, where everything was deliberate, in a way gives a bit more credibility to this idea of a model as an art medium, right? And the analogy there is, people would think nothing of installation artists considering all the different aspects of someone's experience as they walk into a room, right? Or they would think nothing of someone producing a video game, which is a bit more of a corollary maybe with a model, where they consider all the different areas that you might end up going in. And we would make the same argument for models that in the short term, it's harder. It's definitely the longest path to assert that kind of control over things or authorship over things. Um, but we think that's where it's going, and that's kind of where our interest is, right? Yeah.
So the kind of the next big step in this AI machine learning direction that you took after Spawn was Holly Plus. And I find that kind of fascinating because what's more ethical than experimenting on yourself? When you guys, I mean, the idea for Holly Plus was that it's a deep fake twin trained on Holly's voice that you allowed other musicians to use to create their own music. And in this world where, the reflex that artists seem to have when it comes to their IP and their own kind of original styles to try to protect it and make sure that nobody can, kind of can replicate what they're doing or displace them in some way. Um, how did you have a different approach to that kind of fear of displacement? And what led you to create Holly Plus as an experiment?
I mean, I've been working with the digitally processed voice for so many years. When I learned that you could make a model of a voice, that seemed like the natural next step for me. Because I've always wanted to see what you could do with a voice that isn't like physically humanly possible. And yeah, kind of back to the last question of like, what data do you source? Well, it didn't really seem appropriate for me to ask anyone else, like Little Mermaid Ursula style, like steal
Right.
steal someone else's voice. It was like, okay, if we're gonna do this, we have to use my voice. And it's not even like I think I have the best voice in the world. It was just like, this is what I have and this is what I feel comfortable training on. And I have to say, it's been a process of like of becoming comfortable with the idea. Like the first time I heard, and we have multiple models that we use. One of them is real time. So when Matt picked up the microphone and spoke through my voice, I heard my voice, but with this like Matt's like kind of hybrid British accent, and I had to leave the room for a minute. I was like, okay, this is just too weird. Like this is. It was like this uncanny out of body experience. But then after working with it for a while, it became really clear that there was just so much that people could do. So there's just so much creativity that could come through a kind of openness towards my IP that felt like the kind of natural direction for us to take it in. But I totally understand that that wouldn't be the right decision for everyone.
Yeah,
It's
and I
kind of
mean,
interesting in light of like, the reason that self-portraiture was such a big part of like, the art of the Enlightenment was that it was the material that you had at hand.
mhm, mhm.
Everybody like Rembrandt didn't have to go out and pay for a model in order to literally, a model in order to paint his self-portrait. So it was it was there ready for use. But on the, in a more contemporary kind of perspective, what you were doing is interestingly creating a product. You were turning your vocal signature into a product that you could bring to market. And that seems to lead up to the next step in the development of spawning, which is actually founding a company. Um, so what was the original vision behind spawning, and why did like going into this kind of more corporate format of creating a startup rather than an art collective? Why did that make sense to you?
Well, I think, I mean, it's very closely tied to Holly Plus in a sense. One, because the main observation, or maybe the other interesting question that came up from dealing with Holly Plus was this idea of saying, okay, we're falling somewhere in the middle, right? We're not copyright maximalists. We see how those very well-intentioned old kind of protocols are really being stretched with this new paradigm of how these tools inherently work. But at the same time, you need some kind of protocol of interaction between people, or some kind of agreements around data and models that don't exist yet, right? And so Holly Plus was an experiment to do that, where the protocol we put in place was anybody can use the voice for free, but ultimately it would benefit both the person who's the subject of a model and the person using a model to co-sell works that are ostensibly co-authored together, right? Um, and so so taking that observation, someone approached us. I mean, we'd never intended for it to be a company per se, but someone approached us and was like, okay, you've done this. If you were to turn this into a company, what would you do? And our thought at the time, this is pre-GPT, this is before kind of AI mania. We were like, look, this large scale web scraping training data paradigm is just a really interesting problem. And someone needs to be sitting there thinking about it. And so, I mean, the reason to put a funded company together in that context is just, you know, you really got to understand, or I'm sure you understand, but other people might not. The resource asymmetry when we're talking about these problems is staggering, right? So the idea of being able to put a small team together with us and our collaborators to really focus on this data question was it's a drop in the ocean compared to the budgets. I always joke that we're less than the weekly snack budget of Google. The whole organization is funded for less than that, most likely, right? So um so the but yeah, so the idea there was really just to say, if we were to at least have any designs on making an impact in this area, it needs to be funded, you know, because, and we've also seen this too with other projects we've done, right? Like Holly Plus was actually very well received in policy circles. We know that it's been quite influential in terms of some large AI companies thinking about how to approach IP. But those projects kind of come and go, because as an artist, you have a really hard time sustaining work, developing things. You're kind of tasked to produce symbolic gestures that then come, go, you move on to the next project, whatever. This data question is much more complicated, for better or worse. And so that was kind of the idea, just being like, well, what if we did take the germs of these insights, who else would do it, right? Maybe we should give it a go to do this. That was the thought process.
Hmm.
And it's been bumpy. It's been bumpy, I think, for taking that decision. But I certainly don't regret it, because we've learned a great deal.
I'm so curious about the venture question because as artists who are also entrepreneurs, did you go to art collectors as your early investors, or did you go to venture funds? And how did you pitch them on the ROI? What was the business model that was able to actually get them over the hump of being, oh, this is an interesting project, into, oh, this is an interesting project that I can actually have returns on my investment?
We
It's actually
actually
the
were
opposite. Yeah. Sorry, you go,
well,
Karen.
we did a TED Talk in what year was it, Matt? Was it 2021?
I think so. Yeah.
It was one of the COVID years. Yeah, we did a TED Talk where we kind of demoed Holly Plus and the timbre transfer in real time. And it was actually after the talk, we were talking with someone who happened to be a venture capitalist, and he was like, let's make, I think this is a company. Let's try to do something out of this. So it was purely off the back of the TED Talk and the Holly Plus project.
Yeah, and I mean the other bit of context too, which is the weird blurry atmosphere of like Twitter or whatnot, is that given the nature of some of the stuff we do, for years we have had people approach us to be like, "Hey, could you turn this into a company?" Like, and we'd always kind of said no, but that just kind of felt like the right time. Qualified a little bit, I think, by a general sense, not of impending doom. I wouldn't take it that far, but like there was a real strange period of time from like 2017 to 2021, 2022, where our sense of urgency about this general question was not matched by the world, right? Like we put out a record with Spawn in 2019, you know, cover shoots for magazines, big publicity around everything, being like, no guys, like this is really serious. You really need to take this seriously. And it was treated a little bit like, as things do, like in the usual kind of discourse cycle, this is a talking point of the year. Another, like, what's the future going to be? And we're like, no, 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 this is not the future. This is the present. We need to do something immediately to address this. And everybody should be having debates about what the future of media is and so on and so forth. And so I think that by the time it got to 2021, the idea that someone was there being like, maybe the best other approach is you'd be taken more seriously if you set up a company. We were ready to listen to that because the arts wasn't working in that. The line I always use on this front is that there's a point as an artist where, with beliefs and with deep research, you kind of realize you're the entertainment. Your argument isn't being entertained, right?
Ah.
And that is something that I think was driving us a little bit crazy, and I think that there is just some truth to the matter that if you want to move from the kids table, which is unfortunately where artists are often placed in these discussions, people take companies more seriously. It's like marriage and grandparents or something, it's like yeah. And again, for better or worse, I mean, the flip side of that, of course, is that so we've never once had a conversation about ROI, not once.
With your
Because
investors.
it's clearly not our, no, it's not our focus. Like we're trying to solve a problem, and if we manage to put a dent into that problem, I assume that it may be valuable, right? But
Hmm.
we're quite clear that that's not, we didn't turn into kind of like startup people overnight or anything. It's just, I just think that there's a degree of trust that people have that, when we say we're working on something, we're going to really work on it, and I think we have.
So I want to get to public diffusion, but before then, could you just talk a little bit about the components of spawning up to public diffusion, like its various products?
Yeah, I mean so we put spawning together. The condition to actually start it was that our close collaborator Jordan Meyer and Patrick Hupner join, because they were brilliant people who we've met through the AI art community, and they have so much experience and skill to bring to this issue, particularly on the data science side. So we put together a group that is now up to 6-7 people, to yeah, to just kind of like try and understand web scale data. So, when I say web scale, I mean like billions of images, right? Like this, and then understand, what IP might look like in this kind of new paradigm, right? So we built a website called haveibeentrained.com that's still up. And the original idea was to give people a mechanism to understand what data was in these models and search for themselves, search for their artwork or whatever, just to get some kind of understanding of things. And then while putting that together, we dug into the law, and it turned out that in Europe, in the EU, there's a law called the Article 4 copyright exception that basically says that it's fair game to train on anything publicly available on the internet. However, to release a commercial model, at least in the EU, you have to observe machine readable opt-outs. And it was this thing that was made. I think the law was put in place in 2017. And it was not really designed for the world we live in now, but it just so happened to be on the books. And so we're like, that's interesting. In which case, what we'll do is we'll just stick on top of haveibeentrained.com the ability for people to say, hey, my work's in here, I'd rather it wasn't, right? So that then turned into an open source protocol. We call it the Do Not Train Registry because that people understand that better. That now there's 2 billion individual works registered with that registry. It's integrated into Hugging Face, which is kind of like the GitHub. It's where everyone gets their AI models. A number of AI companies have used it. The biggest ones haven't, which is a whole thing to get into. And so from there, we built other tools. We built something called the Kuduru Data Defense Network that was a fun project. We, almost as kind of like an art performance, we shut down all global image training for 2 half-hour periods with a pretty nifty piece of code that we couldn't keep that on because then we really get into trouble. And then we built an interface called Source Plus. And the idea with Source Plus was it's kind of a place for people to process their data as they train it. And so the focus up until now has really just been, okay, if we wanted a consenting world of data interactions as a kind of substrate to build more interesting interactions on top of, these are all the tools that AI model trainers would need. And as a result, we've been brought into a lot of kind of policy discussions, particularly in like the EU and the UK, who are taking this most seriously at the moment. But in a way, it's definitely been impactful, which is not to say it's been a success yet. But it's still surprising to me that, in terms of dealing with anything on this question, the work we've done is, I would argue, quite far in advance of any of the major companies.
Okay, so I mean, maybe this is a good point to just kind of paint a picture of the opposition of the problem that you guys are aiming to solve, which is that, for this past decade, AI development has been dominated by these mega tech companies like OpenAI that have argued again and again in court that first of all, the transformative nature of AI training falls into the category of fair use that allows copyrighted materials to be, trained without permission. So they're using the fair use argument. And then they also say that the development of AI is so important for the future of humanity that when it comes to training on non-consenting creative work, the ends justify the means because you just can't create this kind of you can't create AGI without basically breaking a couple of eggs. And I wonder, Holly, what do you make of those arguments?
Well, I think it's interesting to, I feel like the debate, probably most people not included in this conversation, but online it's become this very pro or con kind of black or white debate. And I think you can be very pro AI development and want to see that move forward, and also pro human and pro yeah, pro consent mechanisms and all of those kind of like sexy in between things that we advocate for. That's one of the reasons why I think Holly Plus and the voice timbre transfer stuff was so powerful, because I think it very clearly illustrates how if if a third party could just take someone's voice and then monetize that, how kind of personally how kind of personal that would feel if someone was able to just really take your likeness and make something without your permission. I was choosing to do that. I was kind of opting into that and kind of setting the parameters for that in a way that I felt comfortable with. But I think the reason why that project was so sticky is because it kind of scared people in some ways. They're like, wow, I'm a vocalist. What if Google could just take my voice and then make, infinite songs with my voice? And so I think there has to be some sort of a middle ground where you know, OpenAI makes incredible products, and they've also spoken publicly about how there needs to be a new social contract around these new systems. And so, the time to figure out that new social contract is not after we kind of like steal everyone's data and like decimate the creative ecosystem. It's like that you have those conversations, you think that through from the get-go, and that should be built into the building of the tools and built into the building of the systems themselves. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think that I don't think you have to hamper creativity by thinking about how everyone fits into the picture. And I think that that's what Matt and I have proven time and time again with our art projects, like with the Call of the Serpentine. I mean, that was all about consent, and you still have a really beautiful model at the end. With Public Diffusion, that's all public domain imagery, and you still have a really functioning model. So I don't really think it's an either or. I think that I think you can have your cake and eat it too.
Ha! I love your
I mean,
term, the sexy middle for this. The sexy middle ground is
well,
catchy.
it's certainly not fashionable on kind of attention networks like Twitter, right? Because you kind of get the most rewards for being the most severe on either side. But to buy into the counter argument though a bit more, both of what you said regarding OpenAI may well be true, right? But interestingly, so the Kuduru project that we did, where we took more of like an aggressive approach on this by shutting down training, was actually done not because we advocate for kind of malicious attacks on people training models, rather to kind of also present for a small period of time the counter argument, which is, if indeed, as is the kind of philosophical framing of fair use, the internet is everybody's to do whatever they want with, you will see more malicious activity like that, right? And we're already seeing this a little bit with the Twitter or Reddit APIs, right? Like, people who have valuable data are not going to continue publishing on the open web in a completely fair use environment. They will put up walls, and they will put up paywalls, and they will protect their data. So on the one hand, this is what makes the issue so complicated, right? You have brutal international competition with different approaches towards copyright, all of which are valid in their own right. And then you have this sticky challenge of like wanting to keep the web open and wanting to get individuals who contribute value to this new substrate compensated in some way. And that's why I think ultimately you have to, being pragmatic, look at the middle ground in how you approach this, right? Because I think that it may well turn out that the fair use argument holds water. We'll see. And then what, right? And so our approach has been rather to say, okay, well, then let's think about this more interesting paradigm where everybody is very aware that their data is contributing to this global intelligence. What does that look like? So we don't actually have to take a severe position on either side of this. I just think that that's likely where things are going to go. If that makes sense, it's yeah.
I mean, like, with the big thinkers about the overall arc of AI development basically say that it's going to disrupt labor and that we're going to need to have a universal basic income. And it's like, the disruption is underway, but then there's this kind of yada 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 universal basic income kind of
Yeah, that's
kind
that's
of
always
thing.
that's always the thing. Oh, we'll just have a UBI. It's like, well, it's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
how many wars and revolutions exist between the technology and the UBI is kind of, unspoken. And it sounds like you guys are actually doing like the hard work of trying to to sort through these problems. And now, there's this period where, America's top models, like these supermodels you were talking about from OpenAI, Gemini, you know, they've been spending this near infinite amount of money to expand their data training sets to the entirety of the internet and then beyond the internet with synthetic data, and now trying to create these world models where they pull in things from the physical universe. And the idea is like to build the most powerful tool, you have to have the most data. But there's a lot of excitement, I believe, around what you're doing with public diffusion. And Holly, you mentioned a little bit about how public diffusion works. Can you talk about what's so exciting about it? What's the insight that is kind of at the heart of public diffusion, and how does it work?
Is that for me or for Matt?
What do you call it? Jump ball.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start and then Matt, you can fill. I mean, one of the reasons why we're so excited about public diffusion is because we see models as artworks. And so in order to have an artwork that we feel like we could fully own and then sell or have any kind of like economic interaction around, we wanted to feel complete ownership over that. And so if we have a base model that is fully public domain, so it's only trained on public domain images, then we could do a fine tune on our own images and know that we have not infringed on anyone else's work, and could really kind of like sell that model or sell
Hmm.
interactions to that model. And we think a lot of other artists would feel the same. I know many artists have not jumped into the to mess around with some of these models because they have this feeling of not wanting to infringe on other people's artwork. So if you have a fully public domain base layer model, then you can really kind of build economic relationships around that without fear of any kind of change in legislation moving forward, or fear
Hmm.
that you're infringing on someone else's copyright.
Yeah, and I
What
mean
a
the
I
sorry,
just
go.
to throw in the idea that, I mean, what we're seeing in Washington now shows that these gigantic changes in just like fundamental compacts can happen overnight. So that's not like an academic thing. But sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, no, you're right. I mean, and without wanting to get too boring and bureaucratic on the copyright issue, when you talk about DeepSeek and like model distillation, right? So the idea of taking outputs of OpenAI model and then using that to fine tune a model to, to teach it reasoning or whatnot. Part of that is also enabled by the fact that the US Copyright Office and most copyright offices have come to the conclusion that AI outputs can't be copyrighted, right? There's a couple of reasons for that. One that's kind of most interesting in this context is because of the provenance of the training data behind them, right? That's one. They're like, okay, well, we can't really account for this, so fine. Like, we can't. And our position again is one of saying, all this policy likely needs to be reformed for this new world, and it's interesting to look at public domain base image models and also look at their limitations. I mean, public diffusion, it's only a third train now. It's looking really good, but it's going to have limitations because the model is ultimately the data it's trained on, largely. But number two is also just, this gets more in the realm of arts and just general, our ethos, I think, is contributing something to the public should be something that people champion, right? And it's actually a kind of outmoded idea, right? And I mean, us of a certain age will remember Flickr and blogging and the great utopian promise of, CC0 and so on and so forth. And then a lot of that was lost because we publish largely, most people publish now to like 4 places who have terms and conditions that give them access to the data, right? I mean, that's going to be a huge cold shower when everyone on YouTube is, upset that they did actually sign that work away for training, right? And so there's this kind of other bigger question of saying, well, if you wanted AI in service of a public, we need to start thinking far less actually about the protection of works, and keeping all the works to ourselves, and far more about releasing that work so that it might be possible to train competitive models. Whether that's through synthetic data that comes from these models or new insights that people produce. So that, I mean, I guess in tandem also with the Serpentine work that we're doing is trying in a way to kind of revive the beauty of the public domain as an idea that most people who are in their 20s don't really know what that is, right? Like if you grew up on Instagram, that a lot of people don't use browsers. You know what I mean? So this idea that you might actually want to contribute your data to a public rather than meta is something abstract to them, and I think is worth championing if it, even if it may be a long shot at this point. I would concede.
There's a certain like utopianism, like the Brook Farm kind of collective idea of building the community that you want to be a part of. And but okay, so going back to like the organic farm to table kind of analogy, what are the kinds of gardens that public diffusion is training on? What are the sources of this public domain imagery?
Well, we put out, if you go to source.plus, we put out I think the largest ever data set of kind of high quality public domain images, and they were mostly pulled from different European institutions, scientific research community, so on and so forth. And then we did all the tough work to kind of filter through that to get it to be about as rich as possible, about as useful as possible. And you can actually navigate all of that on Source Plus now. It's a pretty cool resource to be able to find that work. But then we pretty much exhausted it. I mean, the PD12M, which is the name of the data set we released, is the definitive public domain image data set. There's no more images. And that's kind of interesting because it in analyzing that too, we've also got a lot of insight into what's missing, So it turns out, for example, that not a lot of people release pictures of corgis into the public domain. Didn't know that, but now we know that, right? And so, yeah, so that's where a lot of that work came from. There's a number of other kind of research organizations who've been taking a similar tack. There's a group in France called PLIA that I saw was in the news earlier today because they've done something related to a reasoning model, but they've been trying to do the same with text to produce large public data sets that are available to anyone to train on. And I think, yeah, on the one hand, it's an interesting research question, but on the other hand, it's kind of, it hopefully kickstarts a conversation. Well, I know that it has in some domains about even like state policy on this stuff, right? There are many different publics. And when you start talking about UBI, for example, this idea that a nation might all of a sudden have to take very seriously what data is being produced by its populace, and think of ways to sweeten a deal to make use of that data and kind of produce a flywheel of value or whatever for them seems quite pregnant right now. And so I think that this idea of public data, whether that means in service of a country or something else, is quite relevant. Yeah.
And how does the so you through Do Not Train and your other kinds of platforms, you have a lot of members who have already kind of like given you a certain amount of data. Is this a community that you feel like could be, like a light switch that could be clicked on in order to come up with some kind of equitable training
Potentially, yeah. It's quite hard to say. I mean, because of the resourcing of the organization, we haven't spent that much time trying to gather everybody, because that in and of itself is like a big job, But potentially, I mean, appetite for this is quite clear. I think that, like, if you look, for example, at the debates that are happening in the UK around their potential opt-out provision, there's national newspapers about the newspaper stories about this. Large performing arts organizations are coming forward with various different opinions. The challenge with anything like that, which is more in the domain, I guess, of politics, is there's always kind of a herding cats problem, right? Of, making sure that, for example, the people most energized by this, who are maybe the most impacted by this, are also getting really solid information about it. And I think that's been one of the challenges I've found. I mean, it's very flattering to suggest that people think we're doing a great job on this, but for every one person that says that, there's two people getting really mad at me on Twitter. or maybe 200 people getting really mad at me on Twitter because I don't take, for example, the line that all of this is inevitably covered by copyright, and we need to burn all the models and start from scratch, which is just inconceivable at this point. And so I think once you get into this domain of politics and trying to amass movements of people, information control is just baffling, and so that's largely why I think we've stuck, at least in this domain, to like doing projects and building tools that demonstrate our vantage point in the hope that there's adoption of them. And the good news is I think that through taking that approach and trying to be somewhat sober about everything, we have actually seen adoption, right? And that's this really fine line between like what being interested in maybe addressing a problem and being imaginative with a problem, and being an activist, which I wouldn't frame us as activists in the classical sense, right? I think that like we're putting out things in the world that represent our opinions and represent our kind of imagination on things, but we're not really in the business of trying to hold up signs, or that's not our tact.
Okay, so maybe this brings us to DeepSeek, which was the big, bombshell kind of AI development that rocked world markets and kind of like seemed to shake things up a little bit. Now the waters have calmed um, a little bit more, but basically it was this Chinese hedge fund managed to create for like what $5 billion, which is very little money. A very competitive world-class model that had this reasoning function, and everybody seems to love it, and it's been incorporated into Perplexity already, and there's some controversy over, whether did it really cost $5 billion? Did they just like kind of like copy existing models from OpenAI, et cetera? But it seems like it kind of reset the playing field a little bit in terms of thinking about what it takes to create like a competitive model. And how did that, what were you seeing when that happened? And thinking about how that was relevant to what you're doing with public diffusion.
Holly, do you want to talk about this?
I mean, go ahead.
I mean, I think as I mentioned earlier, this technique of model distillation isn't new per se, but DeepSeek is obviously very impressive. It was curious to me how it became such a big story. With all the love in the world, we were around, I think we were near Holly's parents at this time, who were very intelligent people, but they don't often talk about AI stuff. And they were asking us about DeepSeek. I'm like, it's interesting that one kind of became this market moving story. What's good about it in a way is that it shakes maybe the consensus narrative up until this point, which has been, give up. There's only ever going to be 4 companies. It shakes that because it's actually way more complicated than that. The bad news maybe is that it brings up a bigger question for me, which is like, if we know that under teacher-student models, which is this distillation process, reasoning can be so easily transferred, what incentive do people building multi-billion-dollar or $100 billion training centers have to release those models to anybody? Right? And so that brings up this whole other question about, I mean, sorry to go there, but like, the notion of democracy is shaken just generally the deeper you get into the tech sphere period, right? Because you have a very undereducated populace and in some cases an even more undereducated governance structure. This idea that there may well be like the resources, godlike resources being put forward to train incredibly powerful models, knowing what we know about how reasoning can be transferred, it seems to me like a very reasonable conclusion to come to, that they might not just be released at all, right? That there will be an AI Lockheed Martin or something along these lines that where and thinking about how that's structured is really interesting, and like definitely in the realms of kind of like present fiction or whatever, like science fact, or but but
Or
that's
like
where my
so,
head goes with it. Yeah.
or like some sort of distant oracle that you have to get special permission from the government to go and prompt.
It's
Yeah, but I mean, the other thing too, which I think is good in a way, is that, again, in the popular imagination, maybe many people are not taking too seriously the kind of severity of international competition over this and the stakes of it. Um, you could say the same in the arts too, right? Like, there's a lot of people who are still in the position where they're like, "Oh, that model's good, but it's not that good." The regrettable news, well, I don't know if it's bad or good, but the news to transfer there is, I've seen the models that aren't out yet. Like, it's done. That we all have to kind of get used to this idea that a lot of human activity is autoregressive, right? You can generate good pastiches of it, very good pastiches of it. Um, and so, in a way, I think any news that drops that ups that sense of urgency, or just a sense of common awareness that this isn't just a passing fad, is really good. And DeepSeek has definitely done that. Yeah.
okay. So in a little bit, I want to get to some audience questions, but there's the big back half of of this topic to cover first, which is like, all right, so in this world where AI is totally pervasive, totally reshapes society, and Holly, you mentioned how I think Sam Altman has already, talked about how there needs to be a solution for compensating artists and creatives who are making this work that gets trained into the data, in the same way that, at least Spotify tries in some small way to, in small imperfect way, to compensate the artists who are in their service. How do you think there could be some kind of form of compensation built out for artists and creatives? And could blockchain help here? And then what kind of future kind of state of the artist's uh, economic kind of existence do you see happening? What's the future state of the artist in this digital world?
Yeah, I kind of think everything's up for grabs at this moment. Like, I feel like we're in a really big transition moment where, everything that we could understand of what an artist is might be pretty fundamentally changing. I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting about this space is that it kind of force functions us to think about how the creative process is collaborative. It is anyways, but these models they kind of only function with, or they function best when they have input from many different people, and then when different people are interacting with them in different ways. And so I think that's something that could be really interesting and is definitely going to be antagonistic to an art world, or even to like our existing IP structures. Like, it's very tied. Like, you made this thing, this you own
Mm-hmm.
this thing. It's not really set up for dual or kind of like swarm ownership. And yeah, so I think that that's going to get really messy, but I think it's also the potential for us to kind of rethink some of these myths that we've been telling ourselves for the last several decades.
It's like
Yeah.
in the cathedral, you don't necessarily know who the craftspeople are unless they like have some kind of, encoded like sign that they implant on someone on like a block or something like that. But the cathedral was like the great collective artwork of
Mhm.
do you see that as
Yeah,
being like a kind of mode
I
for
think so, for
for
sure. A lot of kind of pre-modern conversations kind of come to mind, right? There's that great book, The Invention of Art, right? That talks about a lot of the kind of individualist fantasies that were superimposed on top of the artist, around, and in reality, it tries to go into some detail about, if you would have spoken to any of the great master painters who had these large studios to create things and were to say, what's your special vision, they would have looked at you really strangely, that they didn't have it. Their conception of the lone genius artist who has a special vantage point to share with the world is as much a market construction as anything, right? That the art before this was just conceived very differently, and was rich for it, right? So there are a lot of those like earlier questions, and to Holly's point, yeah, you can't avoid the fact that when you talk about these models, that they're kind of the responsibility of everybody and no one in particular, right? That's kind of this fascinating opportunity in a way to rethink what art is. In terms of the other side, though, something we often like to say is that, you know, tech people can be too bullish on this stuff, right? Where, you know, people proclaim the death of art all the time, and they're usually wrong, or usually when it feels like they're the most right, that's the bottom, you know, and then it gets better. Because, you know, we say, you know, people too readily confuse media for art, right? And of course, anybody probably in this kind of context understands that art is much bigger than any one piece of media, right? Like just being able to generate a cool piece of thing that looks like a painting or a cool thing that sounds like a song, actually it's a lot richer than that. We have these words like artistic practices, you know, that actually like reducing art down to shareable bits of things that you can share on the internet is reductive. It just is, and it isn't how the art world works either, right? Like the art world doesn't give awards to people who paint the best picture, you know. that's not really what art is. Like art is like a very abstract consensus network, you know, debating value and values and meaning and all these different things. And of course that won't change, even though likely artistic practices and you know the ways we value things will, right? But this great debate of what art is it's kind of exciting to contemplate that changing, you know. But
And
it's going to be resilient. I think it's going to be pretty resilient.
I
Hmm.
agree that it's super resilient. And of course, it's impacted by economic structures and distribution. And so as we've, you know, your Spotify example is a really great one because we saw, you know, we've seen the death of the album, we've seen experimental music just completely, you know, not have any funding, and so is more found in academic situations. So I do think these things have real material consequences. But I don't think art's gonna die or go away. I think it will continue to mutate.
My theory is that there's
We
going to
were,
be
oh,
like a
please.
fork in the road,
A fork in the
not to
road.
just like you know, use the predominant scary example that's going on, but like where, you know, as like the digital gets more personalized and persistent and infinite, people are going to want to go into these like in-person experiences in the art context that are meaningful, where there's no right answer, where you can demonstrate human virtuosity, where you can like collectively, you know, construct value around things. Um, so my last question for you, before we go to the question, before audience questions, is what do you think is the future state and role of the museum in this like in this art ecosystem that is coming to view?
Uh, First off, I'd like to validate what you just said and add to it, where I think that again the primacy of in person, in a weird way, you could have argued that 10 years ago, right? Because that was the defense mechanism to social media, right? That things contracted, and you know the Biennale circuit increased, and we used to joke when we were primarily making a living through music that we were employed by the live music industry, right? That there was this parallel world of people putting a bunch of stuff on Spotify, and I don't think we've ever checked our Spotify royalties, not
Hmm.
once.
Wow.
You know, but we had a healthy career touring festivals and stuff and making music and playing music with people, and that's why we got into music, you know. So yeah, but then yeah, the future of the museum, I mean, I think that you know, we were actually just at a small conference kind of discussing this, and the conclusion I came to at least is that you know there's this one kind of vision of it where everyone, I think since the dawn of Instagram or whatever, has, and now TikTok, right, has had this huge anxiety about being irrelevant if you don't kind of buy into the attention economy, right? Like that. And of course the demon that's on your shoulder constantly is being like, yeah, like be more like the Museum of Ice Cream, right? Like make it a fun place for parents to go and want to take pictures,
Hmm.
so then other parents will come and take pictures, you know. And I think that you have to, of course, like factor those aspects because the world is changing and people are experiencing art in different ways. But there is a point whereby you dilute to a point of not being necessary anymore, you know. And so I think that the question now, and I think some institutions do this really well. I mean, I speak about Serpentine just because we've worked very closely with them for the past couple of years. There's a real sense of event when something happens there, right? Because they have a vantage point, they have a strong curatorial position, they have strong characters in curatorial positions who have theses that you can either like or dislike, and some people really like it and some people really hate it. But there's a reason for them to be there, right? And then there's a reason for you to be there. And then when you go there, you think, oh shit, I've got a show at Serpentine. What would I do at the Serpentine, right? Which is the opposite of this kind of globalist social media, everything should be the same everywhere perspective. And I think inevitably that's closer to the answer to the question. It's just like, why should you be there at that time in that location? And actually inviting artists to also contemplate that, which is very much a pushback from the globalist studio model where you just ship an exhibition all around the world, and I think that somewhere in there is an answer to the question, and then you'll look and find that actually the best running cultural institutions already answer that question. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, like my hunch is that, the art world is not only well adapted to become a great place, for like kind of taking refuge in Japanese forest bathing from this digital culture, but it may be the best place. It may be in some ways the best place. Uh, okay, so now that was, thank you so much. Let's go to some audience questions. I think I saw a question from potentially a fellow Finn. Um, Jussi Angela would you like to ask your question?
Wait, was it a question?
Well,
And
it's yes,
wait,
I
a
see a
fellow
question
Finn.
mark at the end of it.
Oh, yes. I guess this was more just like a rhetoric question as replying to the sort of the meaning of the museums, in that indeed it is the aura or the authority of the artist, and in this case, the curator, the space, the history of the museum and this institution, as that's what we're striving for. So this was more as a question. But hey, what do you like? Who's the Finn here other than me?
But my mom is is the
Oh,
Finn,
I
so
see. But I'm
I'm a
I'm more
half
like,
Finn.
I come from Berlin and now I'm at the heart of the Silicon Valley. So I'm very connected to this narrative. Really, like, I love it. Thank you very much. This was just a
I also have
rhetoric
some
comment.
Finnish in me, I think.
No kidding. I can see that. You
Yeah,
can
it's
always
funny.
kind of like
I could only do it once I knew it, but yeah, I get along with lots of Finns. Yeah.
it's always happy to have a rhetorical question from a Finn. Okay, so Daniel, you've got a great question. Daniel DeLuco, you want to ask yours?
Um, sure. I mean, I have a bunch of questions. This is more just
Shoot.
like a plea to revive interdependence, or I don't know what's going on with it in terms of the podcast. It's a great podcast. I'm really invested in these kinds of conversations, so it's awesome to hear how you're thinking about these issues in light of the developments over the last year and a half or so. So that's just sort of a plug for interdependence. The question that I actually have is about sort of community data, like how you're thinking about sort of bespoke like data sets, and how different communities might be able to actually strategically kind of grow and prioritize the collection of data within their communities. I've actually recommended this to Native Thompson via the Alternative Art School as like as this sort of platform is growing, what kinds of modes of consensus can be built within that kind of locale in order to provide that institution and the members of that community access to a kind of evolving model that they can tinker with or monetize or use in whatever way they can. So one question is sort of like, how can that be sort of structured? What would you recommend on that front for organizations like the Alternative Art School? And then the other is like maybe bigger scale, like how much do you think bespoke models, data, and et cetera, will have an impact in terms of the flavor of larger models in terms of their output? Will the sort of like say the Alternative Art School develops this data set and then wants to contribute it to a larger model? Are these the kinds of things that can make the difference in these larger models? So that's sort of the space of questioning that I have.
Holly, do you want to
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions there. Just to start out with interdependence, I very much miss it. I think the reason why we haven't even recorded one is because we don't just want to like start it up and then stop it again. Like if we start it up again, we want to make sure that we can be dedicated and do it for like at least a year or something. And since we had our child, it's just been impossible to find the time. But
The
that
death of
is
it is timed almost entirely with the birth of our son.
Well, yeah, you can hear episodes right after he was born, and I'm like leaving to go breast. He's like crying. It was just like a total nightmare and a mess, and I had complete brain fog, and I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. But as he gets older, yes, maybe on the horizon. I certainly miss it. It's like one of the yeah, socially acceptable ways where you can just call someone that you find interesting and talk to them for like 3 hours. So I really, really miss that. And then collectively owned data. Yeah, this was a really big aspect of the call that we did with Serpentine. So I think that there's going to be an academic research paper released on this specific aspect. So we this was largely through FAE, so the Future Art Ecosystems, and they collaborated with Radical Exchange and I think I might be forgetting someone else. Matt, is there someone else I'm forgetting? Anyways,
There's a bunch of people. Yep.
yeah, it's kind of a consortium of people. And so Serpentine hired a data trustee, Jennifer Ding, and she had this really difficult task of, you know, talking to all of the choirs and answering questions and then getting consensus around how to draw up a contract. And um I think my biggest lesson from it is that it's super messy, and a lot of people don't want to really spend that much time making kind of micro decisions about their data. So in the end, I think that it might just be easier to choose public domain as a kind of like catch-all, just give it to everyone. But as a kind of intellectual exercise, it was really important for us to understand, like, it is a data trust model the best model. Turns out in the UK, it actually isn't the best kind of legal structure. How much time do people really want to spend, voting around the rights around their specific data usage? All of those kind of questions. I think it was really useful as a kind of experiment. Yeah, and if I had a conclusion, it would be public domain.
But
Very
and I'll
interesting.
also just add a little bit there, given the alternative art school context, and thank you for the compliment on the podcast. I do think there's a lot to be done there, and I think particularly in this context of a lot of people involved in institutions, thinking about submitting data to provide a richer context art model for students or people interested in the arts is actually a massive opportunity that I wish I had more time to work on, but would definitely contribute to if somebody did that. Largely because, as most people here will know, the information exists, when you GPT it or whatnot, but there's this whole other vantage point, I think, that could be encouraged, to provide like a richer art historical LLM. I think that that's actually a big opportunity. I just don't know how. I couldn't do it, but I think there'd probably be a lot of interest between institutions in terms of putting that together. Also, because a lot of criticism is either kind of not on the internet anymore, or locked away in books, or potentially institutions, right? So I think that that idea of groups of people or groups of institutions coming together to produce bespoke models for a particularly narrow application is something I think is really exciting. It's just resourcing it and coordinating it is really complicated.
I mean, really, JSTOR should be an LLM. But yeah, we all know the kind of really thorny history
Yes.
of IP with JSTOR, so I won't even get started with that.
Check with JSTOR. I was actually consulting with JSTOR about their API, because they have a whole new sort of integration of their of a large language model, which they're piggybacking off of ChatGPT, and it's a super limited kind of use case. But they're trying to figure out like how to how to manage their their data. And this is the same kind of thing that I've tried to work with them on a little bit. And but again, the copyright issues are certainly there, and also the generative aspect of it in terms of like, is it just sort of search first, sort of reader,
Right.
or is it generative? Do you have the ability to sort of generate new content? And they're very much sort of averse to the generative aspect, which I think is probably the most interesting. And so anyway, that's sort of on the JSTOR front. But
Right. We don't want it kind of hallucinating new academic papers. I mean, we do, but
And that's what deep research is trying to be, right?
yeah. Yeah, that's
All
really
right,
cool.
so if I think that maybe I have 2 minutes for one last selfish question, which is like, you guys have done so much with NFTs and blockchain, and you've really made them work for you as a kind of like artistic revenue stream. We've been talking a little bit about blockchain and AI as being like the peanut butter and jelly of the future, that they're both like born from the same GPU and they taste delicious together, with like, AI creating infinitude and blockchain creating like uniqueness for digital things. How can you see like blockchain and AI um, like, working together in the art context, potentially in terms of creating, monetization for training data or any other ways that you think are particularly interesting?
Well, Holly Plus was actually a blockchain project, and it wouldn't have really been possible through any other method because we were doing automatic royalty splitting, and we had to actually make that ourselves because this was like, oh, what year is this? Like, I don't know, a couple years ago where the the software was still quite awkward. But yeah, we wouldn't have been able to kind of like collectively own a bank account and then have royalty splits and all of those kinds of things using a kind of normal infrastructure. So we had to use Web3 kind of building blocks, and it made it more interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, the interesting aspect of blockchains, to Holly's point, is, you have these public ecosystems with also a lot of kind of, they call them money Legos, which is a bit cheesy, but like a lot of basically modules that you can construct together. You also don't have to maintain the blockchain, right? There's all kind of resources available. But I think in a way, to be what contrarian on this point, even though I love crypto and I love AI stuff, I think the question of kind of value and values here is the big question. You can use these systems in programmable ways, in very clever ways. It's not immediately obvious to me that this AI data question or monetization for the vast majority of artists is going to be solved by throwing these two things together. I think that, not to say that you were arguing that, but that is often argued by some very heavily capitalized crypto projects, let me tell you. I think that there's a bigger space, there's a bigger kind of desire for imagination. I have a bigger desire for imagination here, where I'm like thinking of methods or thinking of ways that people might be able to individually or collectively make a living going forward. It's a conceptual problem there, right? It's amazing that we have all these tools in place that once you come up with a good idea, you can then go out and test them. But there's a lot of, I would argue, like kind of skeuomorphic thinking, right? Of thinking that, okay, well, for example, you used this example earlier, and it's quite a common one. So this isn't a dig at you, but it could just work like Spotify. I'm like, no, it won't. We're talking about like an infinite media environment, an instantaneous infinite media environment, right? It could just work like the record industry or like royalty payments. No. We're talking about an infinite, so there's all the, so in a way, I almost feel like we haven't reached peak despair over the scale of what is about to happen, right? And I think that that's a necessary step to get through to the kind of silver lining of it, right? Where it's like, actually, many of these tools will be really, really handy, but we actually need to start thinking about why it is we value art at all, and then maybe start from that conclusion and pull it down, because it's not going to look like the industries we've had. I just don't believe that personally. So no doubt crypto, all these different tools are going to be really useful, but there's this whole other question of like, my assumption in a way is that we're going to see, just as you saw, for better or worse, right, the birth of the influencer economy or the streamer economy that were very native to the incentives of the Web2 platform. system, I lament. I think we're going to see new kind of archetypes emerge from whatever these interactions are, and that's likely going to be where the bulk of exchange is going to happen, but quite where that lands, nobody knows, right? Like we're shooting in the dark with a bunch of projects that we're doing, but that's also the exciting question. I would argue, right? That yeah.
How awesome. Peak Despair would be a great name for your rebooted podcast.
Yeah, no, it's not really on brand. It's not really on brand, but that's I always argue, I think that like in order to really truly qualify as an optimist, you have to go through the bog of eternal sadness and then surface from it, right? That's true optimism, is that you factored all the really bad stuff that's probably about to happen, right? And then you're like, no, but still there's some ineffable human spirit that will emerge from, yeah. So I think that's kind of that's kind of maybe our position on it. I don't think people are taking exactly. I don't think people are fully factoring how big a deal it is that anyone will be able to generate anything that would have appeared virtuosic 10 years ago, and they're going to be able to do it instantly and lots every day, right? And I think it will overwhelm all of our habits. I don't think social media should be as cozy as it is at the moment, yeah. So I think yeah, all the bad things are going to happen, and it'll probably be good. Yeah.
Wow. What okay, mic drop. Well, thank you so much, Holly and Matt, for coming on the show. This has been it's been remarkable. Super, super fascinating.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's really a pleasure. See you online, I guess. For now.
And I just thank you very much, everybody else, for joining. Next week we're going to have Salome Asega from New Ink, where we can talk to her about like helping artists figure out, their business strategies and creative strategies for this crazy new world that we're imagining over here. And also thank you very much to Digital Original. We are proud to have you as our inaugural sponsors on Art World, and their team is doing some really incredible work in crafting solutions to bridge the physical and digital art markets. And you can look forward to hearing more about them in Art World soon. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you next week.